Oil spiked past $140 a barrel, then came all the way back. US-Canada trade talks collapsed on Friday and tariffs were live by Saturday, and the Panama Canal is cutting ship transits for only the second time in its 110-year history. Season 2 starts now, and there's a lot to catch up on. Hey everyone, I'm Shaun Hagen, CEO of CartonCloud, and welcome back to This Week in Logistics. Each episode, we break down what actually matters in logistics, what happened, why it matters to you, and what you should actually do next. And I'm really excited because Season 2 comes with a big upgrade, and I am no longer flying solo. Some of you will already know from him from our webinars and events, but I'm joined by Javi, and Javi brings years of experience in the logistics industry, helping 3PLs and warehouses get more out of their operations. And he'll be joining me for the news episodes for this season. Javi, welcome to This Week in Logistics. How are you feeling, mate?
Good. Yeah, appreciate the intro there, Shaun. But yeah, super excited to hop into this, kind of give a different perspective here. Both, kind of from the operational standpoint, from the kind of system standpoint, just kind of seeing how everything works kind of on a day-to-day.
And full disclosure, Javi has been one of the most vocal participants in the background of This Week in Logistics. So it was a case of putting money where your mouth is, and I'm very excited that you'll be joining me for this season. And honestly, really great to have that perspective on the table, and also very excited to get a bit more diversification of the accents that we're putting out there as well. So thanks very much for jumping in, and looking forward to working together this year. Now we've been off the air since mid-June, so if you're in the operations, you probably felt shipping costs continue to creep up, delays stretch out, or just your whole supply chain feel a little bit less reliable than it did a couple of months ago. And you're not imagining it. That there's 3 separate stories that are all landing at once at the moment. And they kind of center around some of the themes we've been talking about for a little while now. So the Middle East situation is continuing to push fuel costs around, and there's a pretty dynamic and fast-moving trade conflicts sort of emerging between US and Canada. And at the same time, we've got El Nino cutting ship capacity through the Panama Canal. So we're going to go dive deep onto all 3 of those. But first, let's hit the news desk and get you caught up on what's been happening.
Cool. So the first big one is the US-Canada trade talks collapsed on Friday. Then Saturday, they had about a 50% tariff live, roughly $20 billion. So kind of drop in the bucket there on just Canadian goods. Everything from hockey sticks to auto parts, Canada retailers from about September 8th, targeting steel, dairy, appliances, electronics, kind of anything under the sun coming from Canada there. We'll unpack a little bit more what that means and kind of what that means on landed costs as we dive into the other 2.
And full disclosure again, Javi and I are actually sitting on different sides of the 49th parallel. So I guess you'll know if we don't make it to episode 3 or 4 that the trade war escalated. But it's also probably worth calling out that it's not all in one direction. Caterpillar just booked a $392 million tariff refund as duty costs shrank on other fronts. So we talked about some of that story around having your paperwork and compliance in order as there was so much uncertainty. And I think this highlights that costs are moving both ways depending on the lane and the goods involved, which is exactly why you can't continue to run on last quarter's assumptions.
Yeah. And then kind of the last point there. So cross-border trucking still tight on both sides. So Canada and Mexico, second straight month. So this is supposed to be kind of the quiet season, so to speak. So I wouldn't really count on that seasonal relief that we're typically used to seeing.
Yeah, obviously the opposite end of the spectrum down in the Southern Hemisphere. But on the tech side of things, Uber Freight confirmed unauthorized access to its systems after a hacking group claimed it took control of close to 1 million files, mailboxes, cloud storage, accounts payable records. Now, Uber Freight says it's contained with no disruption to operation, but either way, it's a very good excuse to ask your own vendors what's actually protecting the systems your freight runs through. This is an increasingly important part of how logistics companies look at their tech stack, and we've seen a few high-profile incidents over the last couple of years, and I think this is really just the latest one that highlights the importance of making sure this is a consideration as operators look at what vendors are in their tech stack.
Yeah. And then kind of staying on that tech piece, kind of buzzword here, right? AI. So Gartner research says 67% of supply chain is going towards that AI. 55% of chief supply chain officers say they're kind of unclear, what the actual return is. I think everyone's just kind of slamming that AI thing around, kind of seeing what works and what doesn't. So I would say the gap isn't necessarily the technology. It's just, how it's actually working and that full rollout plan.
It reminds me a lot of what we've been, I think, seeing playing out on the robotics and automation side as well, where very cool solutions, but sometimes they may struggle to solve a sort of Monday morning problem, as we've called it on this show before. I no doubt that they'll get there, but I think that sort of 67% number really highlights that the gap is still there in the implementation. And speaking of autonomous, the Californian Teamsters are suing the DMV over the April rules that first allowed heavy-duty driverless trucks on public roads there. Now, whatever you think of the merits, the practical read is that the regulatory timeline in California just got longer and less predictable. If a vendor's pitch around automation assumes that those rules hold as is, that timeline now has a genuine variable on it.
And then on the water, so ocean rates are rising, so not softening. Jury's World Container Index about 4%. So looking about 45, 26 US dollars per 40-foot container as of August 20th. So it's really driven by the Trans-Pacific trade. And then the Panama Canal is about to make that even worse. And we'll dive into that a little bit more, kind of get into these deep dives here.
Cool. And then finally, on the local Australian counterpoint to that news, the Port of Melbourne just closed out FY26 with a record 3.52 million TEU, up 3.8% year on year. June alone was up 7.3%. And for context for our North American listeners, that's the middle of winter in Australia, which also happens to be sort of the quietest part of the year with no holidays around. So the fact that Australian volumes are holding up even while the risk story unfolds everywhere else is, I think, quite a positive sign for the local market. Now, before we move on to the deep dives, our logistics fun fact of the week. FedEx robots are now loading trailers by themselves at their Hagerstown, Maryland hub. Live at full production scale, not a pilot. FedEx and Dexterity have expanded a robotics partnership that they've been piloting since 2023, and Dexterity's dual-armed robot called Mech is now working a 325,000 square foot facility.
Yeah, actually, I read a little bit about that one. So Mech actually has an 18-foot wingspan, which is wild, and then reaches about 7.5 feet vertically. So kind of getting close to Wemby numbers there, but he handles packages up to about 132 pounds. And then it runs on a model called Foresight, combines like kind of vision, depth sensing, and then touch to decide which package needs to go. So it's not just kind of a blind automation. There's actually some logic there behind it. So actually pretty cool to see.
For any listeners that are interested as well, the fact that this sort of popped up as the logistics fun fact this week of all weeks was quite interesting, because if you haven't already seen it come across one of your news feeds, go and check out the robot Olympics that are running last week in China, and it's pretty funny to see that compared to obviously what we see in logistics space. And anyway, I won't spoil it for you, but go and check it out. But I think the reason that this matters is that obviously this FedEx application is a scenario where they load tens of thousands of trailers a day across its network, and that's a physically demanding, high turnover job in sort of LTL freight, and that manual burden is now being removed by automation. And I think it highlights where automation is strong, and that's where businesses have obviously the scale and capital to invest, but they have the consistency of workflows to solve a very specific part of the supply chain, and that's where robotics is going to be stronger than just sort of general purpose, multi-client facilities where the workflows and requirements vary. So I think it's really cool, and I think we'll probably continue to highlight some of these as the year goes on. But it'd be great to see that continue to get rolled out. Anyway, on to deep dive number one. And when we closed out season 1 in June, the Iran framework deal had just been announced, and our working range for Brent crude was $75 to $95 a barrel with some downside protection. And here's what actually happened while we were off air. Brent spiked past $140 in July, the highest since 2008. Then he's back to 76 to 88 range, and today it's sitting around $92. So the range did hold for most of that window, but I think the July spike is the reminder of why we said the downside protection and quick recovery mechanisms are essential, and you can't plan around just a single number. Now, obviously, the story isn't finished. This week, the US Treasury announced fresh sanctions on entities doing business with Iran. Oil is still moving through the Strait of Hormuz, but the risk premium is back on the table. And a quick refresher on why operators should care. Hormuz is the narrow shipping route that roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes through. So when tensions rise there, fuel costs and war risk surcharges rise to anyone shipping by sea or air.
Yeah, and this is actually where it really gets the operators, right? Because the headline number, everyone kind of sees that, but what we're actually seeing on the ground is a whole different story.
And I think that what we've been seeing on the ground is actually a little bit more acceptance of this being the new norm. And whilst it's sort of not a single kind of consistent message across our, network and customer base, people we're talking to the industry, I think people have done a reasonably good job at putting in place some of these mechanisms. It's obviously been going on for a while now, but interestingly, the feedback from a lot of sort of customers and partners in the space is that this just is what it is, and they're probably more focused on controlling things that they can control rather than sort of sweating about some of this uncertainty in the Hormuz and oil pricing. Now, that still shows up in landed costs and operating costs and sort of volatility. And I think the other part where we've probably seen this being highlighted is increasing need for transparency and granularity around what is driving these fuel surcharges. So breaking them out rather than, really, I think, getting really detailed about how that's being represented on invoices and, load sheets, broken down by fuel charge class as well. So at this stage, I think it is what it is from an operator's perspective. It means it's obviously still front and center of planning, but I think it's probably just highlights the importance of having that visibility both in terms of your own rates and charging, but also from what you're being charged by others. So the guidance from last season doesn't change; it just gets reinforced. So price for the range, not the headline. Make sure you've got that flexibility in your sort of pricing system, that you can keep the adjustments mechanisms live, and don't unwind that field discipline just because numbers have calmed down. I think we've seen, even in the US, Canada, that how quickly things can change, which is actually obviously a good segue to our deep dive number 2, which is if you or your customers touch the US Canada border or have Canadian sourced inputs anywhere in the supply chain, your landed cost assumptions just change overnight on the weekend, not gradually and not in one direction. And I think the sequence here matters. So talks broke down on Friday. Tariffs are live by Saturday. And as Harvey mentioned earlier, that's 50% on around $20 billion of Canadian goods, which is around 5% of everything Canada ships to the US annually. Canada hit back on the 8th of September on steel, dairy, appliances, agriculture, equipment, and electronics. And remember the Caterpillar refund from the news desk. Some lanes are getting relief at the same time as others are getting hammered. So both directions, different lanes, same week.
Yeah. And then on that too, Shaun, I guess the question we keep getting from our operators are, and their customers are asking the same thing pretty much, is like, what does it actually mean to my services? And so as we're looking at these cost rises, is it delays? Is it, extra charging, kind of those, if you mentioned some of those fuel surcharges. And then I think the one big thing underneath is all of that is, what's my plan against everything, to kind of, help counteract, especially, I think a lot of these operators kind of just end up eating some of the costs, but really kind of having a good plan going forward.
Yeah, so I think that the reality is you can't plan against a single number because there isn't one. I think if the fact that trade partners like the US and Canada can have such a rapid change in such a short period, you kind of need to be planning against a range and staying flexible and responsive, but you do need to be reviewing that weekly. I agree with you. I think that for some of these changes that happen so quickly that operators have in cases ended up wearing those costs. But I think that again, it highlights the importance of knowing what the costs are, what the impact on your business is, and stay close to your customers. Like keep the communication lines open, make sure that they know as well, so that hopefully you can kind of, partner with them to sort of navigate the volatility. And I think that's really the main thing to take away from an operator's perspective is you can't plan against last week's numbers because last week the USMCA was on the table. Now they're already gone. This week it's the border. Last month it was Brent. Whatever's driving the number, whether it's a strait, a border, a canal, the operator response is the same. I think it's you need to be getting your admin in order before the next one lands because there will probably be a next one.
Deep dive number 3. So this is the one adding a second independent reason for ocean rates to keep climbing, especially as we're coming into that peak season here in North America. So from September 4th, Panama Canal caps daily transits to 34 vessels, down from the average about 35 to 38. And then it's going to drop again to 32 on September 15th. So in the 110-year history, that is the second time that Panama Canal has done this and had it this way. The first was back in 2023, which, just that 23-24 drought that really caused that. And then this year, it causes El Nino. So rainfall from May through August ran about 34% below the historical average. And then watershed inflows are down about 44%. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration puts the odds at a roughly 70% that this becomes the strongest El Nino on record by the end of 2026. So if you're in the mountains snowboarding, probably good for you. If you're in logistics, probably not so good for you.
I must admit, since we started this podcast, I feel like we've had a string of sort of bad news for operators, and unfortunately, once again, carriers are not waiting to pass the costs on here. MSC has raised its Panama Canal surcharge from $100 to $149 per container, and CMA CGM went to $500, both effective mid-September, specifically on the Asia to US East Coast and Gulf trade, which is exactly the lane that the canal's obviously there to shortcut. And I think here's the part that stings for operators is that those surcharges land on top of what we've just been talking about. Geopolitical risk premium already hitting, in rate cards, Hormuz, US, Canada, basically a few independent cost drivers all hitting the same freight at the same time. And I think that just highlights the challenges for operators at the moment.
Yeah. And so on that, right, like who feels it? It's across the board. It's kind of that ripple effect. So importers, exporters, 3PLs, handling Asia to US, Gulf Coast. So ocean freight specifically. And so that's you or your customers. The window is kind of right now, right? That's when you're supposed to act before that mid-September. And then we'll get real specific in the playbook coming up.
Yeah, I think it's worth also restating that, like I said at the start, there is that counterpoint from Melbourne, from the news desk. We have records for important volumes holding up in other parts of the world. So the risk story is real, but it's not uniform. And the Australian operators are running a different playbook to the ones the North American importers need right now. And, as we move to wrap up the episode, onto the operator playbook. And so 3 things to actually do this week.
So 1, requote anything moving through the US and Canada. Just make sure you're getting the best price there. Not next time it comes up, but like right now, so you can stay ahead of it. Tariffs are live and retaliation lands September 8th. So if a quote is sitting in your pipeline and you're using last month's, just make sure you requote that and make sure you're getting the best rate.
Number 2, if you're moving freight through the canal, call your Asia to US East Coast or Gulf carrier now before the September surcharge hits. Ask what your specific contractor rates look like post mid-September, not the published surcharge. Locking that answer down now is a lot cheaper than finding out an invoice at the time.
Yep. And then 3, just send an email to your top freight tech or software vendor, just asking, what protects your data? What guidelines do they have in place? The whole Uber Freight incident is a reason to ask this month. Not someday, don't be proactive, not reactive. Takes about 5 minutes and you'll get a real answer, why it's, up and fresh in everybody's mind.
Cool. Thanks very much, Javi. So for the watch list for this week, does Canada's September 8th retaliation trigger another round of US tariffs in response?
Yep. Do Iran and Oman actually finalize a deal that keeps the Hormuz transit stable, or did the new sanctions push oil back towards that $140 July spike?
And do more states follow California's lead on driverless trucks? Because if they do, regulatory risk is stacking faster than most automation rollout timelines currently allow for. Javi, great first episode. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Shaun Hagen. He's Javier Hernandez, and this has been This Week in Logistics. Nothing about the fundamentals changed over the break. Control what you can control, and don't let anyone rush you into a plan built on last week's numbers. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Yeah.